Acha, permission to begin.
Yes.
Andy Warhol never came out himself. But when Andy Warhol had huge amounts of writing that focused on the valorization of drag performance, that he showed his deep interest in the concept of masculinity and how he was fascinated by it, he was evoking his raw emotions. And his thoughts were probably queer as well. But he never openly expressed himself into a category. The burden opposition has in this debate is not to run that we are being dishonest, because we should stow our honest opinions. They have to show why categorizing yourself into a separate identity is exclusively important. But secondly, what is queer opacity? Queer opacity is the refusal of the notion that making your identity legible is something that is compulsory in society. So you reject the fact that confessing your identity or coming out of the closet is a duty. You resist fixed identity labels. That is not just that you're gay or you're straight. Gender or for example, sexuality is a lot more of a fluid concept. Note the aim here, and this is a trade-off we're willing to make. Our aim is not to make queerness digestible for the masses. It is to show the raw, most open possible form of it. Two arguments from opening government. First, on how forced legibility is a moral crime and we prevent it. Second, on how queer opacity is far more truthful because it doesn't recognize queerness as a static concept. First argument, I want to preempt here. People who want to come out of the closet can probably come out on either side of the house. I.e., you probably have some movies, you probably have gay role models on social media, etc. This debate is about the value of aesthetic expression. So opposition needs to prove that we already have resources for people to come out, why this becomes exclusively important. We think that historically, states have functioned on categorizing people and fixing them into boxes. So states treat people in terms of different races, different genders, different classes. And we think your interaction with queer people has largely been similar, that you put them into a box. So for example, 30 or 40 years ago, most countries diagnosed people being queer as having a mental illness. So that's a box you put them in. But even now, you treat them as different. You have a different set of rights for those people because you think those people are fundamentally different from who you are. What is Foucault's analysis on this? Foucault says that sexuality becomes governable only when it's spoken into existence, i.e., once it is legible, it can be policed. So what does that materially mean in the context of this debate? If you publicly declare your sexuality in all instances, it's far easier to fix you into categories. So then states can pass value judgments on what is okay, what isn't okay, because there is a clear line between what your identity is and what your identity isn't. So the ability to police it becomes a lot more when it becomes legible. Yeah. What is the comparative in this instance? Not right now. With aesthetic opacity, I want to give the example of Andy Warhol here again. Andy Warhol can't be labeled as a gay activist. So the state can't crack down on Andy Warhol by saying that he's campaigning for gay rights, because queerness becomes, number one, a lot more ambiguous on our side of the house. So it isn't that there is a clear line, it is that specific traits that you follow might be queer, might not be queer, but represent his subjective experience. But so I think you focus a lot more on traits. Notably then, we think that if we're less visible, it becomes far more difficult to administrate upon it. So I want to impact this very clearly. Especially in repressive states, people no longer feel the need to come out insofar as being gay becomes less about the identity and more about the specific traits that you can show within it. So you can still, for example, show intimacy. You can still, for example, show sexual desire, but that need not be labeled under that context of an identity. Notably then, the most vulnerable people can have an identity on our side. People who can't be gay on their side of the house because the state will crack down upon them, because you don't need to be legible to be a part of the gay rights movement. Second argument. Before that, we think queer opacity is truthful as it recognizes that being queer is not a static concept. Note, to be legible, the identity has to follow a few characteristics. Number one, it has to be stable over time. So the reason why race and gender can be an identity or fixed identity is because those concepts are far less changing. But second, it has to be coherent. So while things like class can change, the reason why there is still an identity based on class is that there is a coherent specific identity that the working class has, the middle class has, etc. So on their side of the house, the kinds of identities you have are ones that become a lot more static. So for instance, you have things like fixed sexual orientations. You have things like coming out stories being very linear. So for example, you come out of the closet, you fight against your family, you own yourself, you become yourself. That is the kind of linear stories you have at opposition. What is the comparative then, and why does it become important? We think the problem is that queerness is not something that is static. Why? It's based on fluid experiences. It's based on situational experiences. And it's very important to contextualize what this looks like. This looks like, for example, a queer person might have romantic desire, but might not have sexual desire. A queer person might have separate days when they feel like they are one gender, other days when they feel like they have another gender, because gender essentially is a fluid concept. So your identity is something that is not static. Notice then, that on their side of the house, that is the box you place queerness into, that queerness needs to be one thing or another thing. Before I move on the comparative, I'll take what
you stress on the specificity of aesthetic expression, but then make a case about the interaction with the state. How does your personal style necessarily count as an interaction you're having with the state?
So it's not that the person, it's not that Focault is talking to the state, it's that people in these contexts, people who are queer, are probably reading other writers who they think are queer, or reading other writers that they think they relate to. This debate is about the people who read those mediums. Notably, those people also mostly are on social media, stuff like that. So they always the option to come out. There's notably exists any other option for these people. What is the comparative then? On our side of the house, queerness can be something that is fragmented. It can be something which is metaphorical. It can even be something which is contradictory, that you do not need to feel the same thing constantly. Notably then, things like desire, things like longing, things like intimacy can still be expressed on our side of the house. That's not what we're denying, but they can be expressed in a context where they don't need to fit into a specific identity. What are the impacts of this? The impacts of this is, firstly, meaning this is a faithful representation of queer life. Queer life is not as binary as opposition bench would assume. And yes, some people might say it is. But why do you need to restrict alternate information for people that says that it isn't? Second, we think you can provide space for people who don't fit into those boxed-in labels. So those people on our side of the house who don't relate to any kind of queerness do not need to adapt to any one of it. They can just display those traits and not necessarily have that identity. Opposition then has two very specific burdens. Number one, why you need categories and why categories are exclusively important for gay people. But secondly, why is this only achieved through aesthetic expression? I want to remind you of these burdens because OO probably won't do it, CO definitely won't do it. So you remember these burdens where you're giving a clear ballot to opening government for first place.
If the state has the capacity of policing specific gender identities, presumably they also have the capacity of policing traits that you're going to exhibit on your side of the house. We believe policing traits is far worse as compared to policing identity, because to the point at which you're unclear about the identity that you're going to opt for, every traits become immoral because of the social standards and the religious belief that people have in the status quo, and your ability to resist these structures is also significantly less because you never embraced the identity that you believed that you were a part of and use it politically. The second thing then they say is that you're more likely we believe gender identity is fluid. We also think gender identity can be fluid, but in a world where fluidity is not compartmentalized into the choices that you're going to make and the information that you have about those choices, then you're presumably not making an informed decision as to what you regard or what your preferences are in the status quo. I think on a comparative, when gender expression becomes restricted to the identity that you can profess and the identity that you're significantly clear about, it is not ambiguous of being in and out, of being ascribing to the popular conservative structure that exists in the status quo, but is radically different. Your ability to opt into it and better understand this identity significantly increases on our side of the house. We don't think people have the burden of not changing their identity. This is something that is explicitly present in the status quo as well. The last thing that they say is that art exists, and we are likely going to make art very political, despite the artist not being political and not being a part of this identity. We think this is a huge problem because insofar as artist does not expressively ascribe to the identity that he has, the impact of his art also loses its meaning because people do not buy into it. People from your own community would not feel that it is cathartic, would not feel that it is representative, hence they're not going to engage with the art that you're making. But the second problem then, even the state's perception of this art is completely clouded, and without the pressure point of the support that you're going to have from your loyal community member, it becomes significantly hard to enforce why this art is significantly important. But what is the true characterization of this debate? We believe gender queerness in the status quo is not opaque in the majoritarian perspective, because in the status quo you have things like practicing pride, embracing pride, and using the rainbow flag to identify what you are and what you exist. These choices have been possible because of the harms and the oppression that previous individuals have met within the status quo, which is why we believe a cross-dresser in Pakistan is significantly more important than a person who is ambiguous about his sexual identity and wears masculine clothes despite not knowing what he ascribes to in the West. Insofar as that is true, these are the people who have made the significant amount of choices that have led to the expression and the acceptance of gender identity within a wide community of people who ascribe to this belief. Insofar as that is true, these individuals have made the most amount of sacrifices to get the right to protest. Insofar as that is true, we think the choice that you make of making your art triptych does not achieve the important endpoints that it wants to achieve. One, because art is political, because it needs to be expressionist and it needs to be representative. Insofar as you're not representing the people who've made the harms, who've borne the harms of being very expressive in the status quo and have been oppressed and harmed by the state, we think your art does not give them a meaningful experience, does not give them the privacy. The second important thing is, what is art going to look like at the proposition and the government bench as a whole? One, we believe it is going to be incredibly cryptic, because you're not going to be able to translate the meaningful experiences because you've not felt the experiences being meaningful in the first place. Without you embracing the harms of being a lesbian in Pakistan, your ability to write about it and express it maturely is significantly decreased. The second thing then is that pride embracement in the status quo exists, and we have contemporary knowledge regarding the third wave of feminism and various gender identities that exist. This means people have an expectation from the art that you're going to give them and what that art is going to be. Insofar as this expectation is not met, it becomes very easy to dismiss the art that government bench is going to create as incredibly cryptic, as incredibly opaque. The second problem then is that art on our side of the house is likely going to be clear, but it is also likely going to be significantly diverse, which means the ability for you to shift through various gender identities is an impact that opening opposition unlocks. Why? We think two important examples here are Ocean Vuong, who publishes gay poetry in the status quo, and also you have people like Jojo Siva, who embrace the lesbian and asexual identity in the status quo. Insofar as that is true, their expression is undiluted and their expression is significantly clear. The problem of dilution is that it ascribes to majoritarian perspectives and you're not clear as to what the true gender performance is. Insofar as that is true, your ability to never embrace it quickly and the state's ability to crack down on you significantly increases. But the second problem then is there is a high liberalization in the world, which means the expectation of various genders existing and them becoming a political pressure group is also high. We think the LGBTQIA movement has a lot of voting power in various blocks in liberal countries. Insofar as that is true, we think if your art is unrepresentative of them, if your art does not describe to the problems that they have, it is bad. I'll take one from closing.
Oftentimes, this art is much more representative of these people because you can't categorize all of their existences into a single block.
No, we don't think that is true. Because insofar as it is representative to all, it is not uniquely representative to some. We think this is the some that is the most vulnerable, that is the most important. Because their experiences and the sort of catharsis that they're going to get from your being from their background and also exhibiting the unique things and unique traits that they have in the status quo, you're likely going to be disenfranchised. But much more than just being disenfranchised, we believe it is immoral because of sacrifices that your community has made to get the acceptance that it has within the status quo. I think the delta of this debate is where is art likely going to bring the most amount of change. We think for change, it is essential that your art creates understanding in the people. It is not likely going to create that understanding insofar as it is cryptic and can be misused by the messaging that it has when you're producing this art to begin with. And secondly, it being unrepresentative means that the cathartic experiences that people are going to derive from it and get comfort from is uniquely non-existent. For all these reasons, give this debate to opening opposition.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. The cross-dresser comes out in their side of the house in Pakistan. The next thing that happens is that he gets lynched. He gets lynched because the society is not accepting for him. He gets lynched, and when people see that people like us are getting lynched because they come out, they don't want to come out. This becomes a comparative of life versus their own identity in which sacrifice has to take place. This is not a comparative of idealistic scenarios. This is not a comparative of this should be done. This is a comparative of pragmatism, because what opening opposition misconstrues is that they think that these people want to come out but suppressing come out. But the true comparative is that these people have different diverse identities of LGBTQ, in which the center is not that they want to come out. They perhaps feel, and perhaps heteronormative identities are also different in various cultures, in which male people are perhaps different in terms of masculinity than Western people in East. This is the same because culture identifies identity. 3 responses to their arguments. First, they say, oh, the state is going to police traits, and it is worse than policing identities. They don't tell us why this is worse. But secondly, why are identities and traits different? Second, but thirdly, it is worse off in their side of the house. In so far, in our side of the house, its traits become undefinable, because in this side of the house, traits converge into one. You can think of LGBTQ people, you can identify as an LGBTQ person in this side of the house, so because they coalesce into those traits, from their blue hair, from how they dress, from how they style, from how they come out, and they say, oh, how are people going to become policed in this side of the house? The comparative is that you announce to those people, because coming out of the closet identifies an announcement of your identity. It is words. It is in our side of the house. Traits are various. Traits are diverse. It becomes undefinable. And this is also important because they say that it is immoral in your aesthetic expression if you don't do that. You know what is immoral? If you tell people what LGBTQ identity is, your art and aesthetic expression is then used as a direct influence by the state to police these people. This is a direct link towards oppression that happens in their side of the house. This is aesthetic oppression. Secondly, they say, oh, you have this responsibility of catharsis, etc., etc., etc. Why is it in my? Why should my art be political in nature? Perhaps art is more self-catharsis in nature. If I don't feel that my identity is the one that I'm trying to converge into, it is not perhaps that I should write for it. Because being LGBTQ is a part of my identity. It is not the entirety of my identity. There are things that through which I live my LGBTQ identity and life. That is the more relatable thing. If a thing, and this is what opening opposition misconstrues, if a thing is more clear, it is not necessarily more relatable. And what is the clarity in this side of the house? The clarity is of Western ideology or interpretation of LGBTQ people coming out, more outward, etc., which is unrelatable to the sexuality and interpretations of identity of Eastern people in our side of the house as well. The third thing that they do is that, oh, identity is cryptic in our world. It does not mean that it is not understandable in our world. It is only in so far cryptic because identity is cryptic. Identity is vague. What is ABT? What is Daniel Hassan? You can't formulate into it. Identity becomes cryptic in nature because every aspect of identity can never be central. I am a male, but that is not my whole identity. Identity becomes more relatable in our side of the house, and this is really important because because of 3 things that Daniel tells you. Daniel tells you that policing happens in your side of the house due to 2 things. A, because traits become identifiable. But secondly, you announce that decision. You of coming out, etc. It becomes more identifiable. It is certainly harder to ban these things in our side of the house. This is exclusively important because it creates space for these people to come out in terms of that. How do you ban it? And this is really important. Oh, they say, how do you ban it? Yeah, this debate is about that aesthetic expression. So if you outwardly put gay points into the internet, the state knows that these are outwardly gay points. That aesthetic expression is bad. Why is this important? Because that aesthetic expression, all teams agree within this debate, is important for those queer people. Name their side of the house, this aesthetic expression is not going to have access to these people. Even if access is there, there is no relatability that happens.
Sir.
We stop the active sacrifice. What is the active sacrifice? Our side is the only side that tells you that you can have other aspects of your identity. That you can be a Muslim gay person, an Orthodox Christian gay person, because that is a part of your identity. God, it does not necessarily mean that I may be atheistic in the way that I live. This is the freedom that is only present in opening a women's world, because this means that there are vaster varieties of identity that happen. But why is coercion going to likely exist in this area? Two reasons. A, because when you read this aesthetic expression, you read this art, we all qualify how other people that perhaps belong to these identities, or perhaps we take identities or we learn from identities from art. How Shah Rukh Khan is perhaps masculine, how Salman Khan is more masculine. This is really important because becoming that part of our identity becomes a confirmation that I am LGBTQ. So if I want to be LGBT, I have to necessarily do that. This is a coercion that takes place in their side of the house. But secondly, I am a vulnerable LGBTQ person. I want to have support systems. In that scenario, those support systems are only locked insofar I say that I'm going to dye my hair blue, cut my hair short, and dress like that. Yeah, not wear Eastern clothing.
You don't just support a normal vague idea to exist. We want them to live. To do that, you access change from the state. How can you do that if you can never identify in front of anyone what you're doing?
If you go against the society and state as a whole, what the state does is direct antagonization, is direct policing. What we get is that the state, we reduce the state's ability to have that policing. What we create as a space, and this is also about society, because society within Eastern cultures also have this anti-Western idea, and going so far that they see that this LGBT identity is conjunction with the Western identities, which is going to be prevalent in this side of the house. They reject it because it is anti-tradition, it is anti-society. This only happens in our side of the house, in which various identities have the space to grow, have this that I can be an Eastern, perhaps LGBTQ queer person. This only exists in our side of the house. People are then more accepting of that. People are, because it becomes less identifiable, people are that. This is better inside of the house. We give you freedom, but there is an active sacrifice in their world. Either I can be outward, that means I sacrifice other aspects of my identity, means that I reduce other aspects of my identity. But secondly, I can't be outward. That means that I suppress my own LGBTQ identity because I value my family, etc. The only side in which freedom takes place, the only side that you can live as a religious, perhaps God-willing, abiding individual is us. Our identity of LGBTQ is not central, but it is a part of you. We give more space, we lessen coercion, etc. Really opening up.
Thank you to the vulnerable. It is equal to 9.
The biggest push of opening government is that state is going to ban these types of arts, so these arts should not exist. And all of the impacts are contingent on this idea, because in our world, art won't be accessible. Two replies. One, the state is so oppressive, they are going to ban these actors or these arts as well, and this is highly inexclusive, by the way. Means the delta they are trying to prove is very minimum, and it is not a big of a thing that they are doing. But secondly, even if this is true in our worst case, it means more awareness in our side of the house. Even in the history, or even right now, whenever state bans art, it always creates more awareness in the society. Means campaigns like LGBTQ movements, etc., gain more support in our side of the house just because of the rhetoric that they are going to attain in the status quo. Oh, state banned our art, you should stand with us. These types of narratives can exist more in our side of the house. Second important clarification. This debate is specifically not an actor debate, by the way. Hassan Butt's whole speech is contingent on this idea that this is an actor debate, not on the movements and LGBTQ as a whole. This is also a very strategic call out for our opening government as well. Why this is very bad for their actor then? First thing that they have to say, that your identity is going to become bad in our side of the house just because you can't express yourself. Identity becomes bad when you are not able to identify who you really are. Why this is going to be a version of in opening government world? Because there is a generalized concept. Oh, this art might be LGBTQ because this is a queer opacity out there. You have to understand this. State is going to not ban their art, because you are not going to say that this art is going to be gay or queer before this art being published. This is the only mechanism that should prove their premise. Insofar that is true, it means it is very far difficult for people to access the art that opening government has in this debate. Insofar, state is not probably banning it because state don't know this art is queer in the status quo. Secondly, this debate is specifically not about life and identity that Hassan Barthes is trying to portray as well. Why this characterization is true? Understand, this debate is specifically not about a poor person being gay probably in a small village. This debate is specifically about people who read queer art. It means the people who relate to these types of art are the most important actors. You can't just frame your whole arguments on the vulnerable people on this status quo. But I'm going to win that clash as well, that why vulnerable people are better in our side of the house. I won't take you right now. Second important piece of analysis here. Purpose of queer art is to tell you that you have to stand and probably to identify the things that the identity that you have. This is always going to be relevant in our side of the house, insofar you are expressing who these people are and how these people should portray in the status quo. Probably you should advocate for change, etc. This is where you can generate more impact. The first impact is very simple. LGBTQ movements become better in our side of the house, insofar you have more buying power for multiple reasons. First, the representation increases with Joseph and already has analyzed you. But secondly, it becomes far better in our side of the house insofar more people are buying into this. Why more people have the identity that we are protecting? You need to understand the status quo here. We see a lot of movements even operating right now as well. LGBTQ movements who already have advocated for change. The reason today we have come into a point where we have started to recognize these rights are because of these movements. A, they deserve catharsis, which probably opening OG2 never engages with this mechanism. But secondly, it ultimately means more people buy into this thing. Secondly, in their side of the house, people are not going to come into these movements just because they believe it is okay to be ambiguous. Insofar that is true, why this impact is the most important impact in this debate. One, on probably the scale of impact that this argument is going to create. How the scale of impact means? It means if LGBTQ movements have more inclusivity, it means it can generate more impact in our world. It means this impact can also help the vulnerable people which opening government wants to protect as well. Insofar they would be able to raise more awareness, probably change discrimination laws in the state, etc. They can get better in our side of the house. Secondly, they say moral policing is going to be increased in opening opposition's world. A, they can increase in both worlds which already have been refuted. But secondly, even if this is true, we are okay with it because you have to resist against the state either way. It means if state hates you, the only mechanism of change is not accepting that state is right. The only mechanism that this cycle of probably being in a delusionized identity can only be changed in our world. Insofar you start to resist the identity that state enforces on you. Insofar in their world, you accept the identity given by the state, not express your identity and start to believe that I don't need change at that point in time when other people are not going to feel good because of you, or probably these movements are going to become worsened off as well. Before I move on, I'll take a point from opening.
To police something, you need to define it. How do you define and label vague, ambiguous traits, and how do you justify banning vague, ambiguous traits?
Wait, why this argument is a far bigger concession in this debate? It means they say that their art is not going to exist or people are not going to read their art. Why? Because state is simply not able to ban it. Why this is true? Because if you have not pre-established the fact that this is a queer art, means very less people are going to know about this art in the status quo. It means the accessibility of your art is literally bullshit. It means you achieve zero impact in this debate insofar your art is not readable to many people in the status quo. This is why this POI was also very unstrategic to make. What is my second speaker case here then? The biggest principal harm that you are creating in the society is that people, like vulnerable people by the way, have started to accept the identity. Means they don't need to volunteer for change. It means this is the point in time when you start to accept that wherever I am, it is okay. It means I don't need to change something. I don't need to express my identity. I think this is the worst principal harm that can ever happen to a particular individual. Why this is exclusive to opening government's world? In their world, because of the social norms and
and the social norms and aestheticization of these types of art. It ultimately means people buy into these books and people don't thrive for change. This is their only method to help vulnerable people. Vulnerable people are going to be cathartic in OG's world because they don't express themselves. We flip this idea that this is a principal harm. Even if you are living in a far conservative society, you ought to resist against these social norms. If you accept these social norms, it means it is going to get a far bad impact for the future generations to come. It means it leads to cycle of more delusionized identity, cycle of acceptance that oppression might be fine. It leads to more harm in the longer impact. We don't want it. Thank you.
This art is apparently so vague that queer people themselves cannot understand if it represents them or not. But at the same time, the state will magically figure out a multitude of different trends and ascribe them to queer people. I don't think those two characterizations can still stand. I'm not sure in which word queer people can't understand themselves in artwork, but the state with its, I don't know, like heteronormative structures can understand what the gay people are supposed to look like. Secondly, I also don't understand how the state is going to categorize which traits are queer people and which traits aren't. Because they still live in a world where those traits are a specific umbrella or brand of what queerness then looks like. I think that is their fundamental problem. Because those traits aren't just queerness themselves. On our side of the house, a multitude of different traits can express queerness. These ideas about masculinity, femininity, anything can express queerness themselves. They still think that those traits are still going to be traditional conceptions of queerness that just come out as traits. That's not what's going to happen. Also, on this idea about how even state oppresses you, let's talk about criminality in of itself. I think the fundamental idea is the state criminalizes in most instances just actions. So on both sides of the house, a gay man will probably end up committing sodomy on either side of the house, and that is the thing that's going to get criminalized. But if you want to specifically talk about interactions with larger society as a whole, and state and society and other people around you, that isn't what this debate is about. How you interact with, how your art and culture then is perceived by people, but it's also perceived by you. But the most important thing in this debate is not how your art and culture interact with others and state at large, it's how you understand and choose to understand yourself, because there is a prerequisite to other people understanding you. Because on their side of the house, they rely on an assumption that to understand this art, you never feel yourself represented. I tell you, you never even know yourself enough to feel represented in anything to begin with. You never have the vocabulary to understand yourself. And this is my first thing that I want to run, extension I want. This idea that oftentimes to understand yourself, the vocabulary is inaccurate, inadequate. There is a limited amount of words that can describe yourself. The ability you have to describe yourself is rooted in traditional conceptions of heteronormativity. Even gay relationships, etc., are rooted in those conceptions. And that is my first problem I have with them. The words you have are an extremely limited amount of words. You don't have adequate poetry. You don't have adequate sort of literature, art, it's music, etc., that represents you. All you have is on their side of the house a principle on harm where your identity has been, that identity that's supposed to you represent has been taken away from you so much, but it's doubly taken away from you. Because as an average queer individual, not only can you not see yourself fitting in larger conceptions of what it means to be heterosexual or cisgender, but you can't also see yourself fitting in what it means to be traditional conceptions, what it means to be gay or trans to begin with. Because those are then set binaries, etc., that also exist. So you are doubly oppressed on this side of the house, where not only do you feel not part of the larger community, you also don't feel part of the disenfranchised that you should feel part of. You don't feel part of anything, and you are always then different on this side of the house. That is the problem that exists. You don't fit in any sort of structure, you don't have a community, you don't have words to accurately understand and describe yourself. And that is my second problem with that. There should never be a burden on you to come out. This should exist in how straight people already exist, where there is no burden to express themselves. And they come up and tell you, well, you will never understand. Do you think straight people have to come out and say, hi guys, I'm straight, this is how my experiences function? This is literally what reality also looks like. You can understand people through what they write without them ever having to explicitly state this is how it works. And this is especially important in queer communities that have oftentimes relied on things like queer coding, etc., to have things and acceptance, etc., so you can understand and read through the lines. This is why on our side of the house, queer people can oftentimes understand language and poetry and literature on our side of the house, but states, etc., and larger structures probably cannot. The same way can probably understand that Ursula is representative of a gay man in The Little Mermaid, or like how in Dead Poets Society, Neil and Todd are gay and in love with each other. And like other straight people generally then won't understand that. And that's my first problem with them. But secondly, this is a prerequisite for other people to understand yourself. Because if you cannot understand yourself, there is no purpose to having representation which you never feel like part of to begin with, where other people then seem to understand you. But secondly, I am not sure why we are setting up heuristics for other people to understand you by dissolving our own identities then, by saying that this is what it means even if it doesn't accurately represent us. Because if we've been oppressed, if we've been taken our identities away from our own hands, then the burden of understanding should fall onto them, not onto us, to make ourselves more palatable, to make ourselves more accessible, to be understood. It should be ourselves that we should try to understand first, not them, but sure.
If gender experience is so general, then specific unique ways in which you make yourself feel comfortable, like sodomy, are not talked about, because you pander to the lowest common denominator of what your gender identity is.
I don't know. I think there's going to be a multitude of different things that you can write and talk about and think and express your will. There's different sort of fashion and gender conceptions. There's different sort of things and people. No, one person will not relate to every single gay or queer art that's ever going to exist. They will relate to a subset that makes them feel seen. Just the same way on this side of the house, they will never feel seen in the standard depiction of what a gay man is supposed to be on this side of the house. Second thing then, on this idea about how you're then commodified by oftentimes groups that might mean well oftentimes. So things like neoliberal groups try to co-opt your identity just for profit maximization and corporate greed. And the ideas about how they try to make things like make Heartstopper, of which the traditional conception of like a big dude with a small little Twinkie guy, that's the traditional conception of what gay relationships look like. They then take your characterized identity and profit off of it without A, ever making you feel represented, but B, never giving you anything back in return. But secondly, that characterization also exists on right-wing movements on their side of the house, where they take a traditional conception of what a gay man is supposed to be and they make it as extravagant as it can out to be. That a gay man is supposed to be this feminine, lispy, Twinkie guy that exists. And that is what it means to be a gay person. On our side of the house, when you have such diverse experiences and understandings of what it means to be queer, it's far harder for those right-wing movements to co-opt your identity and use them for their own benefit, because they can't characterize one extreme movement. Secondly, on their side of the house, you also have far more, you force people to come out, etc. as well. Think about actors, etc. that you historically have to force to come out, because you don't let people just be. You force on burdens onto them that they must be gay or they must be straight, and that is the only sort of representation that you can happen. Lastly, on self-defense, and I think this is the one large thing I'm going to talk to you about. I think oftentimes the ability to understand the way we get accepted in society, especially in a lot of these developing and vulnerable communities that we're talking about, is that other communities, especially heteronormative participants in the community, feel like they have ownership over our identity. So that means that to be in the closet or out of the closet are decisions that they make on our behalf. But to be neutral, to be expressive in your identity without ever having to explicitly come out or never being in the closet, means that they don't have control over how you choose to represent yourself. By giving into binaries about coming in or coming out of the closet is when they have control over how you must represent yourself and how you must be. When they don't have control over you, you have a far larger acceptance of who you can be and how you must and can identify. That is something that exists on the side of the house. Notice, I also don't know why this debate is just taking place in developing and vulnerable communities, why this debate can also not take place in the larger developed world, where you don't have to have expectations of people coming out and traditional notions of exception either. For all those reasons, closing over.
The personal is political, and this is how we will demarcate ourselves from opening opposition. The point here is simple. We do not think that any art that relates to queer people can ever be created before the point in time people can actually understand what identity they identify themselves with. And note, here's where all teams fail on this idea, because what their identification of being queer is one broad identity. We do not think that the queer identity exists within that spectrum. This means there are nuances to this idea then, right? So for example, we co-opt series analysis into this idea. The fact that you're forced to fit into this structure of being an indeterminable identity on all sides of the house here. The idea here is simple, that your identity is indeterminable. This is different from when you're able to identify yourselves into different spectrums. So for example, being pansexual or being asexual. We think there are so many different facets of being into a queer identity that wherein you try to group all of them together, one, you deter people away from that identity wherein they feel contradictory feelings. So for example, somebody can be bisexual and want to have sex with females and males and other transsexual individuals. Somebody can be bisexual and aromantic, and somebody can be asexual and pansexual. In these sides of the house, then we feel there are so many contradictory identities existing even within the queer idea as a whole, wherein you try to accumulate all of them together. People will not try to enter that identity in the first place because they don't feel like they're being represented within that identity. We think that on their side then, on government side then, you're trying to amalgamate the queer experience into one objective idea, either you're gay or you're a lesbian, either you're queer. We do not think this is a place where people will actually be able to relate into themselves. Into that ground then, we think this indeterminable identity then is actually harmful for queer people because they're never able to see themselves truly represented. Because no, the queer experience isn't just being queer and just that in itself, right? The queer experience is having minute moments that allow you to realize the fact that you're actually queer. So for example, having a crush on your girl best friend while being in an all-girls school, or feeling weird at girls' sleepovers because you don't really feel like you're a girl there at that point in time. We think that all of these experiences are unique, and wherein you find your community is only wherein you're able to feel yourself represented, and that community then exists within objective labels. So for example, being bisexual, or for example being asexual wherein you don't want to have sexual relations with your partner. We think that wherein you group all of these people together, they do not feel they identify themselves under the queer identity as a whole. But then on the secondary level, we think that these end goals or these identification marks are so generalized then that even straight people feel like they're part of the queer identity then. Because note, there is no demarcation as to what your identity exists on their sides of the house. This is harmful for actual queer people who are trying to find their way into the world and trying to find out what they actually identify as. And a few extensions onto this, right? But before that, note how I take government out of this debate, right? Because the point is, they want to achieve change from the state. Change can't exist wherein you're not able to express yourselves freely, and that is contradictory with their entire idea about we don't want to be digestible to the masses. But to be digestible, you're literally just generalizing your entire identity so everyone can see, hey, we are just queer and then want to get change. We don't think in this side they actually ever prove anything, right? But then on to my extensions. Firstly, on how you owe a reparatory duty to yourself. We think that what they do on their side of the house is rather than actually accepting the harms that come with being queer, you're trying to reap benefits from both sides of the house. So you reap the benefits of being a gay lesbian or gay person and trying to enter gay bars, but you also reap the benefits of being so ambiguous that you can enter straight spaces and then be able to access benefit off of that. This is bad because this means that the true queer experience, which comes with the harms that you then face of being queer, are never experienced by your side. And we think this is how we weigh out opening from this debate, because opening proves to you why art is important. But to be able to create that art in the first place, you have to identify yourself and identify what you feel. We think within broad, ambiguous identities, people are never able to put out what they truly feel into the world because they don't know what they actually feel. This then is bad because your reparatory duty to yourself on how you deserve to feel truly, how you deserve to have authentic intimacy within the world, and how you actually deserve to feel truly and have good connections with people fails. We think then secondly, the idea in this debate is simple. This is what Focault said also. You derive your value from your interaction with other individuals. Wherein you never are able to interact with a community that is similar to yours, you're never able to identify what you truly are. So for example, if I don't get recognized as a gay person, I won't actually derive value or meaning from my life. This means if I go throughout my life in an ambiguous identity, I'm never able to truly benefit from that, or I'm never able to feel truly whole in myself. Because not the problem here. The fact isn't that you're just queer. It is that your identity is indeterminable. At that point in time, heterosexual people have one label. Heterosexual people are able to feel and complete beings. We do not then recognize why other individuals, people who are then not under this one heterosexual label, are completely void of any meaning. How you just simply cannot perceive them because they're so abnormal. In that in those grounds then, we think that the person is never able to feel whole, they're never able to feel complete, and that you lose your duty to yourself to be able to actually identify as a gay person and to actually be able to live your life freely without any repercussions. We think in that regard then, the person's identity never materializes. But then secondly, let's recognize what actual unique extensions we have. We think that when you're able to maintain this ambiguous identity, you're able to have queer baiting happen. So for example, the idea of heartstopper, right? Heartstopper does not just happen when you have normal labels existing. Heartstopper happens when you are able to keep your identities so ambiguous that you're never able to truly identify what happens. So what media then does is, they're able to create characters that show some affection with their male counterparts but are not actually queer. This means that the representation for your community is something that never actually happens. You're able to say that, hey, but they were just straight the whole time, wherein you were trying to get queer audiences the entire time by maintaining this ambiguous narrative. We think that the representation the queer community deserves is straightforward. They need idols to be able to exist. Those idols are never able to exist wherein you maintain this ambiguous facade. At at that point you are able to reap the benefit of queer people and try to get their audiences, such as in manga or such as in Heartstopper, but you never actually give them the treat that they then deserve. But then secondly, we think that you lead people on. So even within your own personal lives, you don't actually tell people what you want. So for example, the relationships that you then have, you're never able to identify what sort of community you're a part of. So for example, if you have a partner, you're never able to clearly communicate if you're asexual or if you're not asexual. We think at this point, you lead people on, but then secondly, if you have not ever find your own community, your mental health deteriorates, because this means that you never truly exist in a space that is safe for you. So always play by the rules of the society that you exist within. This means that you don't ever say that, hey, I don't want to live with people who are exceedingly radically religious, but rather that I'm a person who lives in a lesbian space. But because your identity is so ambiguous, you're never able to make that demarcation. So if your parents are homophobic, because your identity is inherently ambiguous, you can't ever identify the fact that you radically, vehemently oppose them. You're never able to take that choice. You're forced to live with your oppressors. We don't support that.
3, 2, 1. Two very simple things I want to clarify before I go on to the different frames of this debate. Firstly, on other side of the house, you would still have what is normally known as traditional queer representation, queer media, etc. That was what the nodding of the Dana's speech, and that is the case that we've carried forward to you as well. The importance of this is that it directly negates the entire need for both opposition benches, because to some extent you would still have traditional media that you have to give idols or to give representation to people generally. What we are talking about is that in a status quo, you do not have representation for people who do not feel they can actively buy into these certain specific binary systems of representation. People who feel like they aren't even a part of even the inclusivity movement either. We think those people ought to have methods of representation as well, and we uniquely give them to that. Our model simply is that we think that this is also an acceptable form of expression. It should go hand in hand with other forms of expression that already exist in status quo. Secondly, what does our model look like? I disagree with Sophia. I don't think we should have any labels existing at all. I simply at all. But the problem with those is that they actively constrain people into conforming towards identity they don't even want to exist in the first place. Those people don't feel like they are part of either gay or lesbian or like bisexual. They feel like there's something different. They feel like they're demi-boys or whatever else they are. They should have the ability to do whatever they want to and consolidate themselves, build an identity around themselves and their specific traits. Should not have the capacity. Should not be forced into doing something they don't want to. A couple of frames then. The most important frame in this debate being relatability to this artwork, then traits, and then thirdly, government change for some reason. Firstly, on relatability, I want you to notice here they rely primarily on an assumption that nobody at all will be able to relate to artwork unless it is explicitly told to them that it is in gay artwork or is made by a gay artist. This is fundamentally untrue. We think the way you value art is by reflecting on your own experiences through what you see on writing or in paintings or whatever medium etc. you're looking at. So to say gay people or even straight people can look at that artwork and derive some form of identity from that. That is what we are championing on our side as well. So to say currently some people do not feel that they have the capacity to do so when they are looking at only traditional forms of queer identity. So to say the vast majority, a very big chunk of the LGBTQ movement do not feel they fit into that movement because they do not feel any solace from Gilbert Baker's flag either. We uniquely allow for them to feel that sense of solace from unique varying artworks when there is no inherent label attached to that. But like secondly, even if you cannot immediately understand that artwork to be because it is too cryptic, you can perhaps talk to other people and realize that perhaps it is something. Okay, there are perhaps hidden meanings within this. I can derive meaning from this way, etc., etc., etc. I don't really think being too cryptic is that big of a deal, anyways. Second thing to tell you here is that you would necessarily do in fact needs very blatant, obvious signals to have catalysts for change in society. One, this is inexclusive because you already would have those catalysts existing in our model as well. But like secondly, I'm unsure as to why these can't serve in that same instance either. So to say they might be replacing things like rainbows, but they would still have basic slogans such as equal rights for all, or like everybody deserves to be equal, everybody deserves to be loved as well. Those are very basic slogans that don't conform any identity on anyone. I'm unsure as to why they can't act as catalysts for change on our side either. We take over them in this frame for two main ideas. Firstly, that we don't consolidate people into binary forms of identity. This is very, very important because these are the actors solely who are the most vulnerable in this debate. They have a LGBTQ movement that is championing inclusivity, but they don't feel any inclusivity in that movement either because it doesn't actively represent them or allow for them to be represented either. Secondly, because the adverse harm of their side is simply commodification as well. So to say, you can modify any identity they currently do have into extremely marketable slogans or marketable flags and shirts, etc. as well.
Point.
So to say, their own clothing then becomes their prison or the prison of their identity. We don't feel this ought to happen. We don't feel this ought to happen at all. Before the other clashes, very quickly, I don't understand exactly what Sophia meant to say, but what it came across as is that you won't experience the traditional harms that gay people have gone through, and that is a bad thing. I don't think that is a bad thing at all. I fundamentally think it is in fact the end point we ought to aspire towards as well, that gay people ought not face things like discrimination, etc. in order to form their identity. We think we ought to give them the capacity of forming identities without necessarily having to face any degree of oppression on either side. Second frame then is on traits and whether or not you'll be able to crack down on them. They, for some reason, think that government will start taking down on every single trade and forming people in groups because of them. We think this is a harm that exclusively exists to a much greater extent on their side of the house, because then certain traits are also linked towards things like gayness, etc. So to say, men generally can't go out wearing pink shirts or purple shirts because they think, oh, you must be gay, you're wearing a pink shirt, etc. Or stupid stuff like that. So to say, even arbitrary traits are fundamentally cooped into these identities, etc. as well. I think it's inherently harmful because you are then essentially forcing people to conform to things they don't want to. Second weird thing they tell you is on queer baiting. Firstly, I generally think queer baiting generally is going to be a good thing, the same way performativeness is a good thing as well, because it removes demarcation you have for identities, which is to say, when they inherently allow people to express whatever identity they want without having to go towards labels. But let's assume either best case it is a bad thing.
Point.
I think you necessarily is irrelevant because people generally would still have idols, etc. I don't understand exactly why it would be queer baiting, why they won't actually be queer idols generally existing anyways, or why especially this is that big of a harm at all. Conversely, there are one major thing here. Firstly, that you're going to have witch hunts happening across society. Which is to say, you will pressurize people into coming out and pressurize people into fitting into these binaries. Which is to say, you will never truly be accepting of a gay person who is willingly in the closet for their own safety or their own identity either. Which is to say, the predominant narrative across the world, especially in third world countries, is you ought to come out into some sort of community, even if you don't want to do that either. We think that is inherently a harmful thing for two reasons. Firstly, it is actively putting your life at risk. So to say, you are forced to come out and come into some community which might not actually be safe for you. Secondly, you are rushing people and pressing them into doing something they don't actually want to do either. They perhaps don't want to come out. They perhaps completely content with not telling everybody and just having their identity assumed as well. I don't understand exactly what the problem is without not happening anyways. The third and frankly weird clash is on government. How will you get government change? I don't think any of their cases really exclusive here, considering you still have traditional like rainbow flag, something you can lobby around. We perhaps give you even more benefit because you have a lot more buy-in towards generalized movements, etc. as well. We have a lot more people buying into them, but uniquely as well. It is harder for the government to oppose these narratives as well and harder to demonize them as well. So to say, it is a lot harder for any conservative movement to demonize the phrase "love everyone equally" or "everyone is equal" generally as well. Which is to say, these phrasing has a lot more buy-in power, which means you can lobby them. You're getting a lot more change generally as well. They're a lot more amenable to society in conservative society, etc. as well. So the simple fact that most of their cases are exclusive. I don't know what Sophia was saying, so we win this.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The one community in this world that is actually very inclusive is the queer community. And I say this because to be queer or to be identifying as a queer individual, you don't need to be queer in a specific manner. I don't know why people in this debate don't understand that just the fact that you're opposing traditional conventional standards of what it means or to have a gender identity, etc., cannot be something that can make you queer as well. I think these people can very easily be included in a community which respects and values the idea that you're resisting stuff like straightness, etc., and all that sort of stuff. But secondly, let's talk about where people are actually protected, right? I think OVO does a very good job at telling you how change is going to happen and how these people are protected. Let's extend on these things. Number one, when you are in the middle and you're not identifying as something or the other, you seem weak and vulnerable. Why? Because what the society perceives it as is that you're not owning up to a specific identity, whereby you're scared of admitting that you are a certain way when you aren't. This is important to understand because this means that you're more of a target compared to someone who is openly queer in a lot of ways. This is why it's very difficult to also resist people who are openly gay. And note how this is daily interaction that you're talking about. This debate is not just you going to a protest and the Punjab police cracking down upon you like with Aurat March, for example. This looks like everyday interactions that you're having with people. People are more likely to not be homophobic in instances where they know that people own up to their identity and are ready to defend that identity. But secondly, I think assumptions do not have an extent at government, right? And I say this because when everything is vague and there are no definitions or boundaries as to who you are or what you look like, people will assume and ridicule you for everything and anything. And this is something where their persecution and oppression becomes far, far, far worse. Note how this is different from opening opposition as well. But thirdly, I think you're not fighting the same fight and are not united under the same banner at government benches, right? And I say this because collectivization, particularly for the queer community, has been the core tenet for how they've ever gotten any form of change. This is important to understand because what government benches are doing are further dividing a movement that requires collectivization more so than ever. We're seeing a lot of progress globally around the world. Even in conservative countries, you have bubbles that still have this stuff being promoted and this stuff being inclusive and represented. I think you break that particular unity and communal feeling within the queer community, which makes it unique in the first place. I don't think this is something that is okay because of the same wing that Joseph did. That these queer people who are openly queer in the first place are important, more important than some of these people who feel somewhere in the middle, even though they have certain traits that do look like queerness in the first place. But lastly, I think this is not just an injustice to other people of the queer community. I think this is a principal injustice that you're doing to your own self. Because at the end of the day, the reason why you choose to be somewhere in the middle is because you're forced not to be on the side that you want to be on. Why? Because there is resistance from societal norms. There is resistance from stuff like the indoctrination that has happened through your primary socialization, etc. I think this is something that's an injustice to yourself to admit who you are and be who you are. Take your seats. But thirdly, on the larger principle and responsibility to identity, right? Number one, I think OG's analysis just becomes redundant from the get-go because as soon as it's going to become unsafe to be somewhere in the middle, their entire principle is also going to collapse because the entire argument is it's not safe. You're going to be killed. All of this is going to happen to you. What if the government is like, we are going to identify people who do not necessarily conform to one thing or the other as people who are also targets, right? I think at that point in time, their principle also just automatically collapses because there's no ownership of identity ever existing. I think identity is something that we protect no matter what, sometimes over death as well, and you do that because of the importance of it and because you don't want to live a life where people are telling you how to live. But secondly, you are an amalgamation of experiences you've had and the people you meet. People who also slightly want to be queer on their side of the house with certain traits are also inspired from and have gotten these experiences or this idea from other people who are openly queer. You owe a duty to people who you've learned these things from and you form your identity with the help of because they have been the ones who've allowed you to feel like you belong and feel some form of catharsis within your own self. Because it's important to understand that none of us know everything ourselves. It's very difficult to just identify who you are and understand who you are automatically. You understand this from other people. There's an abundance of people who state that exist, but other people who are missing in that particular equation are the ones who are openly queer, who teach you how to be that certain way or to adopt those traits. I think it's an injustice to those people as well because they're the ones who allowed you to form your identity in the first place. The importance of surface level interactions is also something that I want to talk about, right? Number one, I think change starts from very, very surface level things, which is to say aesthetic expression. I think opening opposition took on a very big burden of proving change in the first place. They were able to do that more than government's idea, but here's why we win over them, right? I think change at a larger level is not possible unless you start from smaller scale stuff like aesthetic expression. The stuff like the clothes you wear, the way you speak, the way you communicate, the way you're owning up to your identity with one-on-one conversations before you go to protests, etc., or try to resist in the parliament, for example. I think this is where we are very, very different because we understand that these things are more particularly important in the debate where you're owning up to stuff where it's more easy to do this as well. But secondly, I also feel like this is individual crisis, not the last chance. I think this is also individual catharsis in a lot of ways because here is where you're also, it's easier to get comfortable with your identity as well. So stuff like clothes that you can wear in spaces which you know are safe is where you actually start practicing your identity, which allows you to find your identity more so as well. On their side of the house, being straight is something that is far easier. So it's always going to dominate your identity. But at the point at which you're participating in other stuff like queerness, etc., in a lot of ways, that is the only point at which you also end up finding your own self. Sophia talks to you about queer baiting and why it's actually very, very important, right? I think queer baiting is something that has become quite prominent and will become more prominent on government benches. And I say this because of a very simple reason. I think people who are queer already have a very difficult time finding people that are like them as well. This is why queer baiting becomes a massive problem at government, because you don't know who you're talking to and who this person is. Queer people already struggle with owning up to their own identity and practicing that in society. Then they also have to move on to having massive trouble finding partners, finding friendships, finding like-minded people like them, who think like them, who practice like them, who talk like them, who style like them, right? I think this is very important to understand, because on their side of the house, there's no accountability for stuff like this. You can just choose to be on either side when it's convenient for you, and it's not something that respects queerness as a whole. At the end of the day, the reason why we take this debate is very simple. I think we don't just prove larger change that we're talking about before, because we feel like that is still more inaccessible and difficult to prove. We feel like surface level interactions improve far more on our side of the house, and these people are not just protected on an individual level, but generally within society as well. For all those reasons, see you.
Thank you so much, guys, for this. This session will be in hall. See you guys there. Good debate.